Lecture 15. King John accepts the Magna Carta.
Welcome back. In our last lecture, we saw how Leonardo di Pisano, also known as Fibonacci, caused a dramatic shift in the fields of mercantilism and banking in the medieval world with the writing and circulation of his Liber Abaci. Recognizing the benefits of this new system of doing math, almost overnight, Roman numerals were replaced with the Arabic system, numerals 1 through 9 plus 0, that we use today. In the blink of an eye, relatively speaking, the medieval economic world was transformed, and Leonardo was hailed far and wide for his contribution to the worlds of commerce, scholarship, banking, and more. It was a turning point that was recognized for what it was at the very moment it occurred. In today's lecture, we are going to talk about a turning point that really had no immediate impact in the weeks, months, and arguably even years after its occurrence. This is the signing of the Magna Carta in June 1215 in the meadow outside a place called Runnymede. Although the Magna Carta is today hailed as a landmark moment in the development of justice, law, and equality, and two of its original clauses are included in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, at the moment King John of England agreed to its clauses, it really mattered only to the king who was being forced to accept it and the 25 nobles who were doing the forcing. A few short weeks after the events at Runnymede, King John rescinded his actions and held the document to be invalid. He even got the Pope to back him up. For a time, it looked like the Magna Carta would be, at best, a footnote in history. But the ideas enshrined in that document proved to be ideas for which more and more people were hungry, and that later generations recognized as being an important articulation of certain key values. Eventually, those ideas would come to serve as the basis for what we call English common law, and eventually, the legal system of the United States. Many others of its key elements would be incorporated into the constitutions and charters of other governments in the modern period. So how did such a non-event turn out to be such an important turning point in the history of the world? That's what we're going to find out today. In order to understand how it could come to pass that a king of England in the 13th century might be compelled to do anything, we have to think back to our lecture on Eleanor of Aquitaine. As you'll remember from our discussion, when she divorced Louis VII of France and married the future Henry II, she brought with her the massive Duchy of Aquitaine. In combination with the lands already possessed by Henry and those he conquered later on, this union helped lay the foundation for what we have come to call the Angevin Empire, which included almost all of Britain, including Ireland, and most of what we think of as France today. Desiring to keep the power that came from having such lands intact, initially Henry II had planned on leaving nothing to his youngest son, John, who came to have the nickname Lackland because of this. It might seem ironic that John would outlive his brothers and come to the throne itself, but as King of England, his early nickname proved to be prophetic, and pretty quickly he managed to lose most of the lands he had inherited. On top of that, he so enraged the Pope that all of England was put under interdict for 6 years, which meant no sacraments or masses could be performed. And one can imagine that this might be upsetting to a deeply religious populace. Eventually, the Pope went so far as to excommunicate John. The youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine also leaned far too heavily on his nobles as he tried desperately to reclaim the empire that had been left to him and which was quickly slipping away. He needed money to fight his wars, and the financial situation of the kingdom was dire, as every time he lost a duchy or other territory, he also lost all the revenues that would have come from those lands. So he did what many kings of England had done in earlier days. When he needed money, he levied a tax on his nobles. Technically speaking, it was the king's right to do this whenever he had need. While nobles had always grumbled at the sudden announcement of the levy of a tax, John went to the well far too often. Additionally, he charged some of his nobles outrageous fees to confirm their inheritances of family lands to which they were entitled. One poor noble, Nicholas de Stuteville, was told by John that in order to lay claim to the lands that were to come to him after his brother's death, he would have to pay the crown £6,666, a sum that poor Nicholas could only come up with by taking out loans, selling off other property, and giving some of his inheritance to John outright. By 1215, his nobles had had enough. Suddenly, it seemed like not a bad idea to invite the King of France to cross the Channel and claim England for himself. The two countries had been linked for centuries, and as you'll recall from earlier lectures, such a thing had been done before. In the face of outright rebellion, John had no choice, after months of resistance, to meet with his barons and agree to their terms. This was definitely a turning point in the medieval world, but not a turning point in the way that so many people today imagine it. What John agreed to in 1215 was a series of articles that severely limited the power of the monarchy in a way that it had not been effected anywhere in the medieval world before this time. But was this the cornerstone of democracy, as some would have it? Was it a triumph for the common man over the runaway power of the nobility? The answer is no, not in the slightest. The Magna Carta, as it only came to be called much later, was first and foremost about protecting the interests of the 25 nobles who drafted and presented it under threat of rebellion against the crown. It helped some other folks at the top of the social hierarchy as well. But for the 90% of English society living life as farmers or traders, the signing of the Magna Carta was a complete non-event. You can tell this by taking a look at the clauses it contains, and also by noting what order they come in. There are 63 articles in the Magna Carta. The three that are most often hailed as a great leap forward for humanity as a whole are clauses 38, 39, and 40. Clause 38 reads, quote, "In future, no official shall place a man on trial upon his own unsupported statement without producing credible witnesses to the truth of it." End quote. Clause 39, which is a bit longer, reads, quote, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land." End quote. Read from a modern vantage point, these two clauses seem to be articulating the right to trial by jury, and many have read it that way. But what it meant at the time was that none of John's nobles should have to put up with his bad decisions unless a group of them got together and said it was okay, just as a group of 25 of them had gotten together to issue the king their ultimatum. Did the barons think they had just made life a little more just for the farmer laboring in his field? Not a bit of it. They probably avoided thinking about farmers and other common folk as much as possible, except for when it came time to claim rents and payments for protection. By contrast, Clause 40, when read all on its own, seems a defiant articulation of the rights of all people. Quote, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice." End quote. At last, a statement of human rights and dignity and freedom and justice, except for the fact that these three clauses are buried deep in the middle of the document. Also, they come after clauses about there needing to be standards of weights and measures when it came to wine, ale, and corn. It also comes after Clause 31, which states, quote, "Neither we nor any royal official will take wood for our castle or for any other purpose without the consent of the owner." End quote. It's also preceded by this curious clause, number 33, quote, All fish weirs shall be removed from the Thames, the Medway, and throughout the whole of England, except on the sea coast." End quote. Yes, that's right. First, we've got to deal with firewood theft, fish traps that are cluttering up the Thames and damaging the boats of wealthy merchants who want to do business, and making sure that a pint of ale is the same size from one end of England to the other. Then, and only then, can we focus on matters of justice and human rights. What dilutes the power of these clauses still further is that they are not even at the end of the document. They are not even the dramatic climax. After the bit about never denying or delaying justice, the Magna Carta moves its focus to merchants moving in and out of the country, discussion of who has the right to do what in the forest, not allowing women to bring criminal charges against anyone, how and if the crusading movement should continue, what to do about those pesky Welsh causing trouble in the west and the Scots in the north, and removing from office anyone related to or a friend of some guy named Gerard of Athay, who apparently was not very popular. There are also several mentions of Jews, an indicator of the rise of the persecuting society that we start to see more and more of starting in the 12th century, and which we'll discuss at much greater length in a later lecture. John also had to agree to give back lands and titles that he had taken from various nobles, and to accept that from here on out, he was beholden to a council of his barons who would have the right to censure his behavior and make him quit whatever it was that he was doing that was upsetting them. In other words, for the first time, a king was agreeing to have his power limited by his vassals, and in this act, many historians have seen the beginnings of the English Parliament, that body so important to shaping English policy at home and abroad from the medieval period to the present day, as anyone who watches the Prime Minister's Questions on C-SPAN or the BBC can tell you. Then and now, the Magna Carta was and is a fascinating document, a window on the concerns of those in the upper echelons of society. It is compelling also for the sheer variation in the matters with which it was concerned and how it describes them. In some instances, the document is incredibly vague. Clause 13, for example, states that, quote, "The city of London shall enjoy all its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water. We also will and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns, and ports shall enjoy all their liberties and free customs." Nowhere does it specify what these so-called ancient customs and liberties might be, or who gets to determine what they are, or arranges to make sure they are enforced, or what the penalty will be for disregarding this clause, or even how that disregard is to be measured. But when it comes to matters of inheritance, well, we can see how important that matter was because of its position in the document. It's clause number 2, and it's also very specific. Clause 2 states that when a nobleman of the rank of earl dies, his heirs shall pay 100 pounds for the right to succeed to their inheritance. In the case of the heirs of a knight, the inheritance tax is to be 100 shillings. Really, you can't get much clearer or more specific than that. At this point, you are surely asking, if the inheritance issue is number 2, then what is number 1? What was the first thing, the most important thing in the minds of the barons? For those of us living in the modern world, the answer might surprise you. But for the medieval world, it made complete sense. The topic of Clause 1 is the Church. More specifically, the fact that, quote, "The English Church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. We granted and confirmed by charter the freedom of the Church's elections," end quote. As you'll remember from earlier in this lecture, I described how John was not the most popular guy in the eyes of the Pope, who had gone so far as to place England under interdict, essentially causing John's subjects to pay for their king's bad behavior. This conflict had come about because John, like his father Henry II before him, had thought it would be a good idea if the crown hand-picked the men in the positions of greatest religious authority in the land, the idea being that the king would then have control over the secular and religious realms. And really, what else was there? You might remember this didn't end so well for Henry. 4 of his knights chased down and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in the cathedral itself, claiming they thought that that is what Henry wanted them to do. For his part, Henry denied giving any such order, but he still had to do public penance for the act. It's another mark of John's ineptitude as king that he hadn't learned any of the lessons of the past. When the position of archbishop came empty, John named his own candidate. The papal court said no, and they named their own, Bishop Langton. He was blessed in Rome, sailed for England, and discovered he was not to be permitted into the country. John mounted what was essentially a religious blockade, and Langton spent several years cooling his heels on the continent. This is what had made the Pope so mad and caused him to lay the order of interdict on England. Again, John didn't think things through. Cash poor and desperate for revenue, he thought this would be a great excuse for taking back the church's lands for the crown. Now, as you'll remember from our lecture on William the Conqueror, after his victory, he bequeathed what amounted to 1/4 of all the land in England to the church, which quickly became the greatest and arguably most powerful landholder on the island. John had his eyes on those riches and claimed them for himself, which in turn made the Pope excommunicate him. This really didn't seem to bother John much either. What did get his attention was the fact that King Philip II of France saw England's weakness as marking a potential turning point for him. If he could get a significant proportion of John's nobles to renounce their own king and throw their lot in with him, he could unite England and France as one nation, ruled from the Ile-de-France and not London or Winchester. In 1213, John finally made a smart move. He ceded his lands to the papacy, then received them back for an annual fee. What this meant was that the Pope was now both the spiritual and the secular, feudal overlord of England. What it also meant was that Philip II of France was suddenly not very interested in launching an invasion into what were now, at least officially, papal lands. The threat of French conquest dissipated, Archbishop Langton got to come home, and declared John was no longer excommunicated, but the memory of this episode smarted, and it almost made of the Magna Carta a nothing. Because when John agreed to accept the Articles in 1215, he certainly did not do so willingly, and immediately upon giving his formal agreement, appealed to the Pope to declare the document null and void, unenforceable, and without significance. Now, with an even stronger vested interest in England and not wanting to dilute any of his newly won authority, Pope Innocent III was happy to issue a papal bull declaring that the Magna Carta was, quote, as unlawful and unjust as it is base and shameful, whereby the Apostolic See is brought into contempt, the royal prerogative diminished, the English outraged, and the whole enterprise of the crusade gravely imperiled, end quote. This decree came down from the Pope in August of 1215, meaning that Magna Carta had lasted less than 3 months. Then things got even worse. John got in another fight with Langton, had to put down additional rebellions throughout England, managed to lose most of what was left in the royal treasury due to a poor decision about where to cross a particular river, and then died of dysentery in October of 1216, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to succeed him. In the 20th century, some scholars have attempted to rehabilitate John and make excuses or offer explanations for his behavior as king, arguing that he really wasn't all that bad. Yes, he was. Bad. No way to put it nicely. He was a dismal failure as a king. In fact, things were so bad that it seemed in the early days Henry III might not last long as king and might be removed in favor of someone who was more mature, skilled in warfare and diplomacy, and who had close ties to the throne and the royal family. Such a person did emerge, but in what is the real turning point in the story of the Magna Carta, he did not try to take the throne for himself. Rather, he sought to save the throne for young Henry by reaffirming the articles of the Great Charter. This man was William the Marshal. He first came to the attention of the world during the Civil War between Stephen and Matilda. William's father John had decided to back Matilda, and Stephen threatened to hang young William, whom he was keeping as a hostage. In what has got to be the most extreme example of calling someone's bluff, John reportedly shouted to Stephen to go ahead because he had, quote, the hammer and anvil with which to forge still more and better sons, end quote. In the end, Stephen could not bring himself to execute the boy, and William survived, grew up, and rose to become the most universally admired knight in the land, serving as right-hand man to 4 kings with absolute loyalty. He served Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, John, and then John's son, Henry III. And it was William's loyalty and recognition that something drastic had to happen in order to keep Henry III on the throne that gave the Magna Carta new life. In 1216, William made a point of reissuing the charter in the name of Henry, and while he kept the bulk of the document intact, he carefully and cleverly amended certain clauses in order to appeal to the greatest population of nobles he could. He needed to keep those loyal to the crown happy, and he needed to persuade those who were disgruntled to come back into the English fold. This was a brilliant move, but again, we need to be clear. The peasants, the traders, the craftsmen, they only figured insofar as they had anything to do with the concerns of the nobles. Later on, Henry would reissue the charter under his own authority, and later kings would follow suit. Over time, it was customary for the full text of the Magna Carta to be reissued every year, and eventually, it was a law that the document be read in its entirety in public at least twice a year. In a world with a literacy rate hovering somewhere between 10 and 20%, this oral reading was hugely important. Without this, there would be no way for the average person to even know what the document contained. And, as has become obvious, over time it was the so-called average person who would come to be most deeply invested in the Magna Carta. This oral reading is reminiscent of another similar performance that happened annually far to the north, in Iceland. In what, in a perfect scenario, would and should be a turning point of the medieval world, but really wasn't, the Scandinavian settlers in Iceland formed what really was the first parliament of Western Europe, and they did it way before Magna Carta, a few centuries earlier, in fact. In the year 930, the inhabitants of Iceland began the custom of an annual meeting, the Althing, which occurred in the warmer months on the plain called Þingvellir. At this meeting, the leaders of various communities, the Goði, would gather to make laws, pass judgment for crimes committed, exact fines, arrange marriages, drown witches, and more. This may not sound terribly egalitarian, but the important point here is that all free men were allowed to attend, and even more significantly, the laws were recited aloud, so that all could know what they were. The man who spoke them held the position of lögsugarmaður, or law speaker, and he pronounced these laws while standing atop the lögberg, or law rock. Iceland's parliament is still called the Althing, and it is the oldest parliament that is still extant in the world today. What happened in Iceland in 930 is in many ways a revolutionary moment, a true turning point. But alas, it was such for Iceland and pretty much nobody else. One might like to imagine that this democratic spirit somehow worked its way south, but in this case, this is a turning point that was significant for Iceland, and really only for Iceland. But to get back to England and the Magna Carta, neither John, nor his barons, nor William Marshal, nor Henry III, for that matter, could have imagined what the events of a June day at Runnymede would eventually produce, nor, from their own perspective, could they see how the moment when a king agreed, against his will, to a contract he never intended to keep, would ultimately transform not only England, but Europe, and eventually the entire world. In the 17th century, lawyers in England, plenty of whom were not nobles, began to assert that the Magna Carta stated basic principles of law, arguing even more vociferously than John's barons had that there needed to be limits on the powers of the king, and that this document had been affirming this fact for centuries. Because the document had been issued, reissued, read aloud, and confirmed by rulers for so long, it had ultimately taken on an iconic, mythologized status. It did not matter that clauses 38, 39, and 40 were buried in the middle of the document. They were important affirmations of human rights and dignity because they were in the document in the first place. The power of the document continued to grow over time. It was cited by the founding fathers of the United States and by those who fought in the French Revolution. And every time someone pointed to the values described in the Magna Carta as an inspiration, the significance of the moment of the initial agreement was enlarged and enhanced, until eventually the barons at Runnymede had become mythologized as freedom fighters yearning to break free from the yoke of the crown. But in fact, they really wanted no such thing. They wanted their king to rule properly, to stop taxing them excessively, and to be sure that a pint of ale in London measured the same as a pint in Winchester, as in Norwich, as in York. Striking a blow for human rights was not on their minds. Some of them, certainly, as men who believed in the class hierarchy of the age in which they lived, would have been horrified at the idea that anything in the document suggested that an earl might have something in common with a blacksmith, or a knight with a farmer. But still, King John's acceptance of the Magna Carta does stand as a turning point, because without his agreement to its articles, reluctant and disingenuous as he was in giving it, the English system of law and justice might not have developed along the lines that it eventually did. And if that hadn't happened, one could go so far as to suggest that the United States, the modern nation of France, and the international body of the United Nations would not exist in the forms that they do today. So although no one really appreciated it at the time, the creation of the Magna Carta in 1215 was a true turning point in not only the medieval, but also especially the early modern world. Other things were happening in 1215, things that, unlike Magna Carta, were actually recognized for their grave importance at the time that they occurred. At the same time, however, Magna Carta provides us a fascinating window on certain attitudes that were becoming more prevalent in medieval society, particularly when it comes to relationships between Christians and Jews, which we'll discuss at greater length in Lecture 17. Clauses 10 and 11 of the Magna Carta specifically address what happens in cases when Christians who owe money to Jews die before the debt is repaid. It is a concern that would be addressed by several of the canons of that other big event in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council. Although few people today could tell you what was important about the Fourth Lateran Council, in the medieval world, everyone was impacted by the decisions that were made there and the canons that resulted from this meeting. As we'll see next time, this other turning point in 1215 dramatically impacted the church at all levels, from the highest-ranking bishop down to the lowliest parishioner, and its influence would be felt across cultures, space, and time, with repercussions well into the modern era.